And it's a time to call to the stage our next speaker that we really all like and love. He helped us a lot with the Flutter Global Summit. We know him for a few last events, and his community also helps us to grow and to bring Flutter to Latin America as well. So, hi. I'm always shy to pronounce your name. Can you tell me once correctly? And I promise I'll try to remember. And you are muted, just in case.
Hi, Anna. My name is Gianfranco.
Gianfranco. Oh, okay. I promise. I really promise I remember the correct pronunciation.
Right.
I will not take a lot of your time. I'll just bring your presentation to the stage. I'll leave it and I'll come back if you have any questions. See you soon.
Thanks. See you. Okay. So I am Gianfranco, and today I'm going to talk about full stack apps using Dart. Okay. But first, let me introduce myself a little bit more. So as I said, I'm Gianfranco Baba, and I am CTO and co-founder at Somnio Software. We are basically a dev shop that specializes in Flutter, and we are the only one in Latin America that really focuses in only Flutter. Then I'm a software engineer who specializes in Flutter. I'm a Flutter developer. So after ending my career, I specialize really in Flutter and Dart. And then lately I've been speaking like in lots of events about Flutter and trying to grow the community in Latin America. This is really great for me and for the community. And also I'm organizer of Flutter Montevideo meetup. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. So moving on, let's talk about more on what I'm going to talk about. This is the agenda. Basically, we're going to cover what is the concept of full stack apps with Flutter and Dart. What are the main problems that in my experience, I identified nowadays? What is the current state of the art in the full stack apps with Dart? And then we're going to present a demo, a brief demo. And finally, I'm going to close the presentation with some challenges and some next steps we should take into account for our future projects. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to mention like a presentation about like the backend as a service options, because I feel like being a Flutter developer, you might know these tools because as you know, like Flutter is a front-end technology. So I guess that whenever you need like to create a backend, you would like to know these options because it really speed up your development, and you don't need to write a custom backend, right? So in this case, we have Firebase, Amplify, as well as more open source options such as Upright or Supabase. And the cool thing about this is that, in some way it lets you speed up the development, but they had their own particularities. In the case, for example, of Firebase, you have a nice integration with Flutter, but you have to use a single database such as Firestore, or even if you want to write your own backend code, you will need to switch language because Dart is not supported for Cloud Functions, so you will need to use, for example, TypeScript. So yeah, and the other options, I mean, they're also great. I think like you need to select it, like try to identify what are your problems that you need to solve, and try to select the one that fits the most for you. But let's go to the problems, right? So one of the problems that I identify in this kind of like apps is that in some apps we have to have like real-time connectivity. So this might be some criteria for me to kind of select different backend as a service, or even try to think if that is even possible using, for example, Dart in the backend, right? Another problem is that we have, as I said, we have different programming languages, because we are often, when we use these kind of tools, we have to switch to TypeScript. So we have to code on one hand, like in Flutter with Dart, and on the other hand, we have to use another language that, despite that both, I guess, are really similar in the syntax, they are in fact like different languages. So you need to that context switching between languages that might not let you being so productive as being, for example, when you are coding your Flutter app, right? So, and another problem that I identify is the code reuse on front end and back end, right? We are talking about like we are using different languages, and for this we need to imagine if we maintain a single programming language, we will be able to reuse a lot of the codes. For example, the most basic, the most common one would be reusing the models. We don't need to write like two different models in two different languages just to communicate the front end with the backend, but instead we have a single source of truth with all the models written in one language, and that's really convenient for sharing code between the front end and the backend. And I guess the last problem will be the developer experience, right? Like if we kind of solve all of these issues, we will be increasing the developer experience, and yeah, we will be more productive in the long term. Okay, so now I wanted to present briefly like the state of the art because this is not something so new, but lately there were like different options that arise in the Dart community. So first of all, we have like Shelf that is more like the bare bones that if you need to compose a web server, you can start with that. This is really stable. We are in the 1.4 version. So yeah, that's really nice if you want to dig in more low level building backends in Dart. But then if you want to start with something easier, I will highly recommend to use DartFrog. That is a framework that is built on top of Shelf and lets you, in a way, kind of like not if you use DartFrog, you won't be programming in such a low level, such as Shelf. So it's easier to start with that. And in fact, we are going to present the demo using DartFrog because it's easier. You don't have to write like a lot of boilerplate code and so on. There are other options such as Conduit that is more older than DartFrog, and also Serverpol, who is an option that when you create your project with Server, it brings you a lot of things out of the box. It is more opinionated, so you will have to select, for example, when you create a project with Server, you will be having, for example, a database, an ORM, and a way in which you can deploy it using AWS, for example. But this is more or less the state of the art, and I think that based on how you want to build your apps, you might select each of them, and especially in where do you feel more comfortable with. But yeah, so moving on, we have like as I said, Shelf and Serverable. Those are also really great options because the last Shelf version was 1.4 since fourth month ago, and in Serverable they actually released the first version of the product. So it's a great moment to start looking forward in these things. And finally, DartFrog, which is the one that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to present a demo using DartFrog. So we are going to talk more about DartFrog. And it's in fact a fast minimalistic backend framework for Dart. As I explained, it's built on top of Shelf. It was made by Very Good Ventures, you might know it. And yeah, what can I say about DartFrog? We are going to see it in action really soon. But these are our basic concepts that you might know if you are starting with DartFrog. For example, routing. Routing is basically how you define your API endpoints. Currently, you can do it you can define HTTP endpoints in a REST fashion, right? And then you can define also WebSockets. That is a change that was recently updated in the library. And the way you do this is by defining your folder structure that will match and in your files will match to the actual routes that you will expose in your API. So this is kind of like was inspired by other tools like Next.js, which kind of like solve the same problem for the routing in the front end by using this structure. even though I think like lately that changed. But anyhow, like this is a really cool way to actually provide an easy way to build your routes. Then another concept we need to cover is middlewares. Middlewares are like no other than functions that sit in front or after your routes. So basically, it's a function that will be executed before or after your route, and this can have like many use cases. For example, I think that the most common one or the most useful could be the authentication. If you have to authenticate your routes, you might put some logic, some common logic in a middleware, and then all of your routes will use that middleware. Or, for example, if you want to log your request after they executed some errors, or if that was successful, you can inject a logger as a middleware. So yeah, this is another concept, dependency injection. This is really well thought in DartFrog, and it's really easy to inject those dependencies. And if you like to then, for example, make some tests, you can easily mock it, and yeah, there is a way in which you can test also your routes in DartFrog. Finally, I also put there WebSockets since lately there was a recent update and support for WebSockets. And this is really cool because we also can solve in a way the real-time connectivity that we were explaining in some of the problems we had. Okay, so here I'm going to share basically a demo of a full stack app, so we can see in action how it's built using Flutter and DartFrog. So basically, we will be using only Dart as a programming language. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Now here I have VS Code open, and we have also a simulator. We are going to like run a simple project. And let me explain first how the project is built. So basically, we have a monorepo structure. And this is one of the advantages also of, for example, using a monorepo could eventually unleash you like for features. Imagine if someone is making changes on the server, maybe you can detect those changes and run your integration test in the front end. So apart from that, you can also reuse all of the code because we are going to create models only written in Dart. So in here we have a basic folder structure where we put our client, that is a Flutter app, and our server, that is a DartFrog server. Okay, so basically I'm going to explain really fast the Flutter app because I feel like it might be easier. Basically, in our client, we have a Flutter app. We have some dependencies here. We are using Blog for the state management. Basically, what we want to achieve in this example is to display a list of users that will be retrieved from the DartFrog API. And not only we will be able to also get those users in real time. So if I make some changes in another client, let's say we are using another client, it could be another simulator, or I'm going to test it using Postman, which I have open here. We will be reacting in real time in our client app. In Flutter, right? So in Flutter, we have some packages, and for example, the user's repository. This package will communicate with the API. This is a common pattern in good practices that we might follow in Flutter. Also, we have a single feature that is users, and we have a view that is displaying the list of users. I don't want to stop a little bit in the Flutter app, but we have also our blog. In our blog, we have our connection to the API directly. This is could be improved, but we'll be seeing more in depth. And our events, so yeah. And then we have to explain how it's built the DartFrog API, right? So I'm going to start showing the server folder. In the server folder, the first thing that we'll notice is that this is a pure Dart package. It's like really common for us to write packages. So has the same structure, but it has like different folders that are like key for DartFrog. So we can go to the passpec YAML and we can use whatever dependency we are used to use in Flutter. So that's really nice. For example, we are using Equitable or HTTP, JSON annotation for our models. So this is really useful because if you are someone who is a Flutter developer, you will have access to all of the libraries that you already use, right? And for example, one of the things that is really important is the route folder. Here, we will be able to define our routes, and this will actually map into API endpoints. So here, for example, we have a structure where I put API, B1, and users, and this will be matched to an actual endpoint that will be, let me show in Postman, for example, localhost 8080 and API B1 users. Okay, so in here we will need to define an index file. In there we will actually create an onRequest method where we will define, okay, based on the HTTP verb that the user is requesting, we will redirect to an actual function that will be executed and will perform some logic. In this case, we are only checking if the method is a get method. And if that's the case, we will be retrieving the user's data source through the middleware, and then we will be executing and getting all the users, and ultimately responding with a JSON of all the users. So it's really simple. And then what we need to explain, okay, what is this data source, right? So basically, this is another concept that we were talking about before, that is the concept of middlewares. So in here, what we have is a user's data source that can be anything. In this case, it's an in-memory user's data source. That means that we are only handling the users in memory, but it could really be information that is, for example, retrieved from a database. And the thing is that we have to inject all of this using a middleware in our request. So by only putting this, we are solving the whole thing about injecting the dependencies, and we will be having access to in our methods, right? So this is another method that I want to explain, that is basically when you have dynamic routes, you have to put the brackets to so that DartFrog can actually know that you are sending also a dynamic parameter. In this case, we are trying to access to a user by its ID. So it's almost the same. We are checking if the request method is if the verb is a get, and then we are almost doing the same, but we are only returning one user and returning. So this is like a brief example on how we can create basic routes using DartFrog. And if we run the server here by using DartFrog dev, the server will be run, and we can test these routes in Postman. For example, here we have like mock data, and if we use get user by ID, we can, for example, retrieve a single user. So this is basic stuff. We have like basic HTTP endpoints, but I wanted to show also the support for WebSockets that was recently added. So basically, if you would like to incorporate WebSockets to your project using DartFrog, you will need to first add a new dependency, because the framework is really lightweight, in a sense that it really, when you create the project, it really have the really basic. And if you want to incorporate new things, for example, in this case, WebSocket, you have to use another library for DartFrog that is called DartFrog WebSocket. And then from a notation point of view, you have to define your file called WS in your route folders, right? So the framework will know that you are exposing a WebSockets endpoint instead of an HTTP endpoint. And in this case, I wanted to show a simple use case of using WebSockets. For example, here we have an on request, and here we can use the patterns that we are really used to have it in our Flutter app. For example, I'm using block in the server. That's really really awesome because I'm really used to use blog in the front end, and I can use it on the back end. These are really different implementation from the more traditional block because we are using the broadcast block, and that would mean that whenever someone changes internally in the state of the block, it will be broadcasting that change to any client that is connected. And this is a really a special use case for WebSockets, right? Because whenever something change, maybe I have like a lot of clients connected to a server, and we might communicate that change to every client at the same time, right? So if we go back, we can see that first we need to initialize the block and subscribe the client, so we can know then that whenever something changes, we might communicate to them. Then I simply return the current state because it is the first time that the client connected to the server. So I might also send the actual state, the actual list of the users in this case. And then I will try to listen for the client messages, so we can define custom messages. In this case, for example, just for testing purposes, I have two messages: adding a user and removing a user. So whenever someone sends that special key, we'll be creating a new user. So we will be adding an event to the block, and the block will do the whole logic. We can see, for example, here we have a map that maps the event to the actual function. And in this case, we are only like copying the list of users that we have in the state. We are adding a new user that is a hard-coded user in this case. And then we are emitting the state, and then everything will be spread across all of the clients. Okay, so if we return to the WebSocket method, the last thing is that we might unsubscribe the client whenever the connection is closed. So we don't have to communicate the changes, or we don't have to maintain that client in our internal list because it has the connection has been finished. Okay, so now we are going to try to run the project and see this in action. Basically, the cool thing about this, while we try to run it, is that we are using the models only in the server, and we have to define only one single file in the server, and we can use these models in the front end, right? So we don't have to, whenever someone change the model, in this case a user, imagine if we are in another property, we don't have to do the changes in both projects, in the front end and the back end. And this really speed up because we have a single source of truth, and yeah, those are one of the advantages of using everything Dart, right? And also, as we explain, also the fact that you have access to all of the libraries that normally are used in Flutter, or even the patterns that you use, such as using, for example, block, right? In here, okay, this is the first time that the user is connected to the server, so the list is empty. But if we go here, this is another nice tip. We can actually test our WebSockets using Postman. In this case, we are going to try to connect, and okay, the connection was successful, and also the list is empty of users. So if we add a user, and the list will change. We will add a new user test, and we can see here. And if we want to, for example, see this in real time, so we can actually know that this is happening, we can send another message, and there is another user there. Okay, so this is kind of like how we can simulate multiple clients connecting and try to refresh your Flutter app to the things that are happening in the server using WebSockets. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is more or less like the example I wanted to show. It has more things, and that I wanted to try to give you a full example of how a full stack app might look like, and the developer experience using your simulator, using only VS Code with the with a single monorepo and Postman in their in your computer. This is more or less the experience. I will leave this example in my GitHub if you want to see other things that are happening there. But yeah, okay, so perfect. I'm going to return to the presentation. So I'm going to stop the screen here. Please, if we can add, perfect, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that if you're, for example, a Flutter developer and you're starting with the concept of full stack and you were relying more or less on backend as a service solutions, you maybe didn't consider all the things that will eventually start to happen. On one hand, like the backend should be maintained and written like if it were a front-end app, like you will have to do custom code there. The good thing is that you might use Dart and that the learning curve, at least you don't have to learn another language. Of course, the deployment will be something to consider as a challenge. If you're deploying your backend, it will depend on your requirements, but I will highly suggest that you have more or less some knowledge on Docker. We didn't see this in the demo, but actually when you create a DartFrog project, under hood, it lets you use Docker to deploy your application, your server. And the cool thing about Dockerizing your application is that you can actually deploy it in any server, and you could use, for example, Cloud Run, but you could use a single instance of a server. In the case of Cloud Run, I will highly recommend to consider or to really know how the platform works, because as it will be scaling your containers based on the traffic, you might be careful with how you manage your state in a single instance and how you can manage the same state across multiple instances of your Docker server. Another thing that you might consider is databases. Right, you will have to choose from a variety of databases, maybe relational or non-relational or even graph databases, whatever it suits your needs. Also, another important concept is the concept of caching. If you want to start adding more performance to your server, maybe you might cache different things that are, for example, imagine if in this example, the user list is something that is really, that there are lots of reads of that list. Maybe you might cache that in the server. So because no one is actually creating that often a new user. So if you cache, you will gain performance because you won't have to retrieve that information from the database, that it will be slow, right? So in that sense, I would highly recommend to take a look on Redis. And of course, the authentication will be another issue you might solve, a challenge. You can also rely on Firebase for doing that if you're used to use Firebase authentication. That is a great option. And finally, the CI/CD part as well, right? If you are already working with some kind of CI/CD in your Flutter app, this will be a good practice that you also take into account in your server. Okay, so what are the next steps from here, right? Because this is like more or less a presentation on, as I said, on how a full stack app should look like. I would highly suggest, if you're looking to create full stack app with Dart, to check out the documentation of DartFrog, because it's really easy to start from there. Also, I wrote a few blogs on how to not only use DartFrog, but also other technologies in Dart for making a backend, if you want to take a look at that. And also there were like some talks in Flutter Forward. I mean, in Flutter Forward, there were like many talks, but I put there like the ones that are more related to this topic, such as real-time games with Dart, that it is a full stack app, but it also has the component of adding Flame to your Flutter project. And also the top cloud development tips for Flutter developers, that are explanation on the challenges that we were mentioning like before. that can happen you in your backend, especially. Okay. All right, so that's it for my presentation. Thank you for having me here in Flutter Global Summit. I really enjoyed it. I leave you my social networks there, my Twitter, my LinkedIn, and the networks of my community in Uruguay. Yeah, it was nice to be here. And of course, if you have any question, I can answer.